In this video we're going to look at the tan, the sine and the cosine functions for each of the quadrants, and we're going to see whether they're positive or negative. Now the first quadrant is this one here, and that's from 0 to 90 degrees. The second quadrant's from 90 to 180. The third quadrant is this one from 180 to 270, and the fourth quadrant is this one here from 270 back round to 360. So let's get into the first quadrant. We'll move this to some random spot in the quadrant. And you can see here I've actually got the values here for the tan, the sine and the cos, and you can see they're all positive values. So let's have a look and we'll see why it is they're all positive. Now the tan function is going to be given by the y distance here divided by the x distance here. So you can see that the y distance is positive, so we're going up the way, and the x distance is positive as well, we're going along this way. So y is positive, x is positive, so therefore the value for tan is going to be positive. So tan is positive in the first quadrant. Now we're going to look at the sine function. Now the sine is going to be this distance here, which we can call y, divided by this distance here, which I'll just for the moment call r. Now this distance up here again is a positive distance, but this distance along here, well, it's neither positive nor negative. In fact, we don't actually care. The only distance that makes any sense is the lengths that are vertical or the lengths that are horizontal. So if you head along this way it's positive, back that way is negative, up this way is positive, and down this way is negative. So going at an angle here is undefined. So all we're really bothered about are this length here and this length here. So for the sine we're going to have this divided by this one here, so it's going to be y upon r, so the y is positive, so therefore the sine is positive in this quadrant. Now for the cosine it's going to be x upon r. Now the x again is positive, so it means that the cosine is positive in this quadrant. So all of the trigonometric functions, the tan, the sine and the cos, are positive in the first quadrant, that is between 0 and 90 degrees. So let's go into the second quadrant. So again I've picked a random spot in the second quadrant here, and you can see that the tan is going negative and the sine is positive and the cosine is negative. So let's see why that's the case. So the tan again is going to be the y divided by the x. So the y is positive, but now the x is in this direction, so we're heading back this way, so the x is now negative, so it means that the tan function is negative in this quadrant. So if we look at the sine is going to be the y divided by the r. Now the y again is positive, so therefore the sine is going to be positive. And finally the cosine is going to be the x divided by the r. Now the x in this case here again is negative, we're heading in this direction, so therefore the cosine is negative in the second quadrant. So we can see here then in the first quadrant all the trig functions are positive, but in the second quadrant only the sine function is positive. So let's move on to the third quadrant. So again a random spot in the third quadrant, and you can see here the tan has gone positive and the sine and the cosine are negative. So let's have a look at those. So the tan is going to be the y divided by the x. Now this time the y is negative, but the x is also negative, so you're going to have a negative divided by a negative, which is going to give you a positive value. So the tan is positive in this third quadrant. If you look at the sine, it's going to be the y divided by the r, so y is negative, so therefore your sine is going to be negative. And if you look at the cosine, it's going to be the x divided by r, well your x again is negative, therefore the cosine is going to be negative in this quadrant. So they're all positive in the first quadrant, the sine's positive in the second quadrant, and the tan is positive in the third quadrant. So let's look at the final quadrant here. So this is angles between 270 and 360 degrees. Now the tan is going negative, the sine is going negative, and the cosine is a positive value. So let's see what's happening here. So the tan is going to be your y divided by your x, so the y is going to be a negative value, the x will be a positive value, therefore you'll get negative divided by positive, which will give you a negative, so the tan is negative in this quadrant. And the sine function is going to be your y divided by your r, and again your y is negative, therefore sine will be negative in this quadrant. And finally, we're interested in the cosine. The cosine is going to be x divided by r. The x is positive, therefore the cosine is positive in this quadrant. So finally, we can say that all of the trig functions are positive in the first quadrant between 0 and 90. The sine function is positive in the second quadrant, that's between 90 and 180. And between 180 and 270, the tan function is positive, and between 270 and 360, the cosine function is positive. So therefore, we can say that all are positive, the sine is positive, the tan is positive, and the cosine is positive. So let's look at a little mnemonic that will help us remember that. So here's a little mnemonic I use to remember this. We have all of them positive in the first quadrant, the sine's positive in the second quadrant, the tan's positive in the third quadrant, and the cosine's positive in the fourth quadrant. So I remember that as all sinners, so S for sin, take, T for tan, and care, C for cos. All sinners take care. So that was a little mnemonic that my teacher taught me whenever I was at high school. I think she was quite a religious teacher. So you can always use that mnemonic to remember, or better still, if you actually understand what's happening with the little dot going round about the circle, then you can work out for yourself where the values are positive and negative. So we can see from this diagram that whenever we are in the first quadrant here, you can see the sign is positive, so this height here is positive because this is positive. So it's positive in the first quadrant, but it's also positive in the second quadrant, so this height's positive. So the sign is always positive, so this is always above the x-axis for the first two quadrants. And then for the third quadrant, it starts going negative, this distance is negative. And also for the fourth quadrant, it's negative. So the sine function is positive in the first quadrant from 0 to 90 degrees. It's positive from 90 to 180 degrees, it's negative from 180 to 270, and it's negative from 270 to 360. So let's do the same with the cosine here. You can see in the first quadrant that the cosine is going to be positive because this length is positive here. So you can see in the graph there, it remains positive in the first quadrant. When it goes into the second quadrant, that's from 90 to 180, it goes negative. And you can see the distance here is negative, which is in effect this distance here, which is negative. When it gets into the third quadrant, the value of the cosine remains negative, so it remains negative because this distance here is still negative. And then finally, when it goes into the fourth quadrant, you can see it becomes positive again, because this distance here is now positive. So you can see this happening within the function. So you can see the first quadrant is 0 to 90, it's positive. The next quadrant, 90 to 180, it's negative. The third quadrant, 180 to 270, it's negative. And the fourth quadrant, from 270 to 360, it's positive again. So finally, let's look at the tan function. So in the first quadrant, you can see the tan's positive, so it always remains positive here. And that's because the y is positive and the x is positive. And when it goes into the second quadrant, you can see that the value for the tan is now negative, and you see it just coming up through at the bottom here. So it's now negative here, and the second quadrant from 90 to 180, and then in the third quadrant it becomes positive again, so that's it heading up in a positive direction. In the third quadrant between 180 and 270, and finally in the fourth quadrant it becomes negative again, so that's it in the negative, and finally at 360 degrees it goes round to 0. So you can see that the tan function is positive from 0 to 90, and then it's negative from 90 to 180, and it's then positive from 180 to 270, and then it's negative from 270 to 360.